Before kingdoms feared armies, they feared whispers in the dark, and among those whispers lived a brotherhood that rewrote the rules of power. A small, isolated sect operating from remote mountain fortresses became one of the most feared organizations in medieval history through a combination of ideology, discipline, and surgical precision that turned conventional warfare on its head. The Nizari Ismailis, known to their enemies as the Assassins, created a network that extended from Persia to Syria, wielding influence far beyond their limited numbers through carefully planned eliminations that sent shockwaves through the Islamic and Christian worlds alike. Their leader, Hassan-i Sabbah, understood something that massive armies often missed, that strategic fear, deployed with intelligence and restraint, could accomplish what thousands of soldiers could not. Their tactics were centuries ahead of their time, anticipating modern concepts of asymmetric warfare, psychological operations, and targeted political action. While medieval armies clashed in open fields with overwhelming force, the assassins practiced patience, intelligence gathering, infiltration, and the elimination of specific individuals whose deaths would shift entire political landscapes. They operated with a code that minimized civilian casualties, studied their targets for months or even years, and created a reputation so powerful that the mere threat of their involvement could change a ruler's decisions without a single blade being drawn. What history remembers about the assassins is a mixture of truth, propaganda, and outright fantasy. Crusader chroniclers, unable to comprehend a military force that didn't function like their own, invented stories of drugged fanatics controlled through elaborate deceptions. Sunni Muslim historians, viewing the Nizaris as dangerous heretics, portrayed them as mindless killers divorced from legitimate Islamic tradition. Later European writers like Marco Polo embellished these accounts with fictional details that captured imaginations but buried historical reality. Modern popular culture has amplified these distortions, creating an image of the assassins that serves entertainment and ideology more than historical understanding. The real story is more complex and more fascinating than the legends suggest. A tale of political exile creating revolutionary ideology, of mountain fortresses becoming centers of learning and military innovation, of operatives who combined philosophical conviction with deadly skill, and of a movement that survived catastrophic destruction to influence ideas about power and resistance for centuries to come. If you want to discover the real history behind one of the most misunderstood organizations in medieval history, subscribe to support this deep dive into the shadows of the past. Leave a like if you're ready to separate myth from reality, and comment what city you're watching from, because this story spans continents and the truth connects us all. The Empire of Shadows began not with armies or fortresses, but with a single man's exile and the dangerous idea he carried into the mountains of Persia. Every empire begins with ambition. This one began with exile. Hassan-i Sabbah's story begins not as that of a warlord, but as that of a man pushed to the margins of power, forced to rethink what power actually was. Born in 11th century Persia under Seljuk rule, he grew up in a world where Sunni orthodoxy dominated courts, mosques, and institutions, leaving little space for heterodox thinkers or dissident movements. His early attraction to Ismaili Shi'ism, already seen as dangerous and subversive, marked him as a problem for the established order, and his eventual break with existing authorities turned him from controversial intellectual into political exile. In that exile, Hassan learned a crucial lesson. If you cannot control the palace, you must learn to control the forces that move around it. Persia at the time was a map of fragmentation. Seljuk sultans, local emirs, Abbasid caliphs, tribal warlords, and competing religious factions all jostling for influence across a landscape of shifting alliances and simmering resentments. This fragmentation made control difficult for great powers, but it also created breathing room for smaller, focused groups able to exploit cracks in the system. Hassan looked at a Persia divided by doctrine, politics and ambition, and saw not chaos, but opportunity. A world in which no single power could fully dominate was a world where a disciplined minority, armed with conviction and strategy, could carve out space to exist and to influence events far beyond its size. Nizari Ismailism, the branch of Ismaili Shi'ism that Hassan embraced, offered precisely the ideological foundation he needed. It was revolutionary, not because it preached violence, but because it proposed an alternative vision of leadership, authority, and hidden truth. At its core lay loyalty to an imam in occultation and the belief that true guidance came from a chain of spiritual authority rejected by mainstream Sunni rulers. For persecuted believers scattered across Persia and beyond, this doctrine provided both meaning and identity. For Hassan, it provided the framework for something more, a disciplined, ideologically unified community that could survive persecution by going underground, organizing in cells, and acting with deliberate, almost surgical precision. The mountains of northern Persia were not Hassan's first choice. They were his answer to necessity. Flatlands and cities were too exposed, too accessible to cavalry and siege engines, too dependent on the goodwill of rulers who saw heterodoxy as treason. The rugged ranges of the Elburz, with their narrow passes and isolated peaks, offered something different, natural fortresses that cavalry feared to enter and enemies struggled to supply during sieges. Here, a small group could defend itself against much larger forces, and a well-placed stronghold could control entire valleys and trade routes. The mountains were refuge, but they were also trap. Once committed to them, Hassan's movement would live or die by its ability to turn isolation into strength. From exile, Hassan began to recruit quietly and selectively. He did not assemble a random band of fanatics. He sought out those who had already learned to live on the margins, disillusioned scholars, young men alienated from local elites, minor officials passed over for promotion, and rural fighters tired of serving lords who treated them as expendable. To each, he offered not just shelter, but purpose. The chance to become part of a community with a clear doctrine, a disciplined structure, and a long-term mission that reached beyond personal survival. Recruitment happened in whispers, in disputed mosques, in caravanserais, where merchants complained about corrupt governors, in villages where local injustice had turned into quiet rage. Early experiments in unconventional warfare grew out of weakness, not strength. Lacking armies, cavalry and siege engines, Hassan and his followers tested other methods: infiltration of towns through conversion and marriage, quiet replacement of local leaders with Nizari sympathizers, and targeted removal of especially hostile officials under circumstances that looked like accidents or unexplained attacks. Instead of storming castles, they acquired them from within, buying land, converting key garrison members, or exploiting forgotten disputes among local elites. Each success taught the same lesson. It was more effective to rearrange the pieces on the board than to flip the table entirely. In these years, the idea of a hidden community slowly took shape. Villages, fortress garrisons, and town quarters that outwardly belonged to the Seljuk realm began to contain cells of Nizari believers loyal first to the Imam and Hassan's leadership, and only second, if at all, to the Sultan. Outwardly, these people farmed, traded, taught, and prayed like their neighbors. Inwardly, they belonged to a network that shared coded messages, safe houses, and lines of communication invisible to officials who believed control meant taxation and soldiers. A map of Nizari influence would not have matched any political boundaries of the time, but it would have revealed something more dangerous: a web of conviction woven through the cracks of empire. The turning point came when Hassan understood fully that ideology could do what armies could not. Armies needed pay, land, loot, and constant victories to stay loyal. Ideologically committed believers needed only a cause they saw as just, leadership they trusted, and a structure that made their sacrifices feel meaningful. An army could be bought bribed, or broken in battle. A small group, bound by shared belief and disciplined secrecy, could survive defeat, exile, and even the loss of strongholds, because the real fortress lay in mines, not mountains. When soldiers follow orders because they must, they break when pressure grows too great. When followers act because they believe they serve a divine and historical mission, pressure can harden them instead of shattering them. Somewhere between his first conversions, his first strongholds, and his first successful eliminations of hostile officials, Hassan-i Sabbah looked out from a mountain and realized he no longer needed to dream of commanding vast armies to shape history. He needed only a core of people, willing to devote their entire lives, including their deaths, to a strategy that combined patience, precision, and faith. From that moment, the secret order was no longer an idea, it was a blueprint. And soon, the rest of the medieval world would learn that blueprint's most unsettling truth, that in an age of castles and cavalry, the most dangerous weapon was a believer walking alone through a crowded city with a concealed blade and absolute certainty in what must be done. A fortress is stone, a legend is something else entirely. Alamut did not fall to Hassan-i Sabbah's army in a glorious siege. It slipped into his hands through patience, persuasion, and quiet subversion. Perched high in the Elburz mountains of northern Persia, the castle was originally a Seljuk stronghold, controlling a vital valley and its roots. Rather than assault its walls, Hassan entered as a guest, slowly winning over segments of the garrison and local population, while quietly acquiring land around the fortress. When the moment came, he revealed that key positions, supplies, and loyalties already belonged to him. The capture of Alamut happened with so little bloodshed that neighboring rulers barely grasped what had changed, only that a remote mountain fortress now answered to a man they had once dismissed as an exiled heretic. The architectural genius of Alamut amplified its new purpose. Carved into a narrow ridge and surrounded by steep slopes, the fortress appeared to grow from the rock itself, with layered walls, hidden paths, and vantage points that allowed defenders to see advancing forces long before they could approach. Storage, cisterns, and terraced fields meant the castle could withstand extended sieges, while internal passages allowed small groups to move unseen from one section to another. Alamut was less a single building than a system of defensive and logistical solutions stacked vertically into the mountain, designed to turn every step the enemy took uphill into a costly mistake. Yet stone alone didn't make Alamut dangerous. Inside its walls, Hassan built something rarer than a fortress, an intellectual center. Libraries housed theological works, philosophical texts, scientific treatises, and maps of regions far beyond the castle's immediate horizon. Secret archives contained reports from agents in cities and courts across Persia and Syria, creating a living intelligence network that transformed the mountain into a watchtower over the medieval Islamic world. Scholars copied and commented on works of law, theology, astronomy, and strategy, while scribes maintained coded correspondence with distant Nizari cells. To outsiders, Alamut was a nest of killers. Within, it was also a school, a think tank, and an archive of forbidden and protected knowledge. Military innovations emerged naturally from this environment of isolation and necessity. Lacking large armies, Alamut's planners focused on improving small unit tactics, stealth approaches, and methods of infiltration. They refined techniques for climbing walls, moving across sheer rock faces, and blending into urban crowds. Weapons were optimized for close quarters, high-precision attacks, daggers designed for swift, deep strikes, light armor that allowed speed rather than prolonged stand-up fights, and signaling methods for coordinating movements without drawing attention. They studied enemy fortifications, not to overwhelm them with force, but to find the single vulnerable point. A guard's routine, a neglected gate, a blind corner that could be exploited by one or two operatives. The psychological strategy behind Alamut proved as powerful as its physical defenses. The very idea of an unreachable stronghold, home to a leader who could not be captured or coerced, unsettled rulers used to solving problems by seizing people and property. Alamut represented something new, a center of power that couldn't be easily besieged into submission, because even if the fortress fell, the network it directed would remain. Over time, stories circulated that from this eagle's perch, Hassan could see everything, that his agents could emerge from nowhere in the heart of a city, that even discussing plots against the Nizaris carried invisible risks. Fear expanded faster than facts, and Alamut's legend outpaced its physical capabilities. Within this environment, the next generation of Nizari operatives underwent training that blended intellectual, spiritual, and practical disciplines. Young recruits studied theology and philosophy to understand not just what they believed, but why they were asked to risk or give their lives for it. They learned languages and dialects, enabling them to move between regions without attracting notice. They practiced disguise, posture, and speech patterns, training themselves to disappear into caravan crowds, market throngs, or palace servants' quarters. Physical conditioning, climbing, running, endurance served missions that might require days of travel, followed by moments of lethal precision. As Alamut's influence solidified, the Nizaris began replicating its model across other regions. Fortress after fortress was acquired through quiet conversion, strategic purchase, or well-timed political intervention. In Persia, Syria, and along major routes, new eagles' nests appeared, smaller than Alamut, but built on the same logic of high, defensible positions controlling valleys and passes. Each stronghold was semi-autonomous, yet tied into the broader network through messengers, coded letters, and shared doctrine. Enemies looking at the map saw scattered castles. Those who understood the Nizari system began to suspect a web, a distributed structure that could survive the loss of any single point. What frightened their enemies most was not the weapons inside Alamut, but the implications outside it. If a small sect, fortified in remote mountains, could influence the politics of sultans, caliphs, and crusader lords, then the old assumptions about power, territory, armies, gold, were incomplete. Alamut embodied a disturbing idea that belief, intelligence, and precision could rival steel and numbers. A ruler could march on a neighboring city, but not on a rumor, could garrison his capital, but not his dreams. The fortress symbolized the uncomfortable possibility that no one, however exalted, slept entirely safely once they had made themselves Nizari enemies. From its terraces, Hassan-i Sabbah looked over more than valleys and snow-capped peaks. He watched reports arrive of officials who changed policies after receiving anonymous warnings, of governors who suddenly treated local Nizari communities with careful neutrality, of rival powers who hesitated before issuing open threats. Alamut had become not just a refuge, but a fulcrum, a point from which pressure could be applied to levers far beyond the mountains. Yet every fortress, however legendary, carries a hidden vulnerability, the temptation to believe that stone and fear alone can hold back the world forever. As Alamut's reputation grew, so did the attention of empires that tolerated shadows only until they interfered with imperial ambitions. Far to the east, a new storm was gathering, a force that did not negotiate, did not fear mountains, and believed that if the world would not submit, it could be burned and rebuilt from ash. Loyalty is easy to claim until it demands your life. The making of a fidai began long before a dagger was ever placed in a hand. It started in the mind, with psychological conditioning designed to replace ordinary survival instinct with something colder and sharper, obedience that did not stop at the threshold of death. Young initiates, often drawn from Nizari families or quietly recruited from sympathetic communities, were immersed in an environment where doubt was discussed, but disobedience was unthinkable. They studied doctrine that framed their mission as part of a cosmic struggle in which their individual life was a small but essential thread in a tapestry extending from the hidden imam to every oppressed believer. In that worldview, fear of death became less important than fear of failing the mission. Rituals reinforce this identity every step of the way. Entry oaths bound the Fidai not just to Alamut or a local fortress, but to the Nizari cause and the Imam himself, creating a vertical chain of loyalty that no earthly bribe could easily cut. Communal prayers, commemorations of fallen operatives, and recitations of key events in Nizari history linked each individual to a lineage of sacrifice. Before major missions, specific rites, fasting, night vigils, private counsel with spiritual guides, turned the upcoming act into both a tactical operation and a religious offering. Success or failure, life or death, were framed as submission to a higher design, not merely outcomes on a battlefield. The code of conduct for a Fidai was simple to recite and incredibly difficult to live. Silence, patience, precision. Silence meant never boasting, never hinting, never using association with the order for personal gain. A Fidai lived as an ordinary artisan, servant, merchant, or wanderer in public, revealing nothing of his true allegiance. Patience meant accepting that months or even years might pass between assignment and action. Waiting tables in an inn, serving in a household guard, tending a stall in a market, all while watching, listening, and blending in. Precision meant that when the moment finally came, there would be no hesitation, no wasted motion, no second attempt. Studying a target could become a way of life. Fidais tracked routines with the obsessive care of scholars constructing a proof. When the target woke, whom he saw first, which doors stayed locked and which did not, what days he received visitors, how his bodyguards rotated posts, which festivals made him predictable, and which sudden habits betrayed fear. They observed not just the person, but the human web around him. Family, servants, guards, informants, rivals. A single assassination might be postponed repeatedly because a child appeared at the wrong moment, a crowd shifted unpredictably, or a new guard pattern created unforeseen risks. The goal wasn't simply to kill, but to kill in a way that carried an unmistakable message while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. Urban infiltration required techniques that would look familiar to modern intelligence agencies. Fidais learned multiple regional dialects, clothing customs, and trade skills that made their cover identities plausible. One might pose as a scribe who moved comfortably in bureaucratic circles, another as a caravan handler with legitimate reasons to pass city gates repeatedly, another as a minor craftsman working near a palace. They practiced how to lower their gaze or raise their voice, how to seem harmless or unremarkable, how to disappear into a crowd moments after a public strike. The city, to them, was not a chaotic mass, but a map of escape routes, shadows, and roles to inhabit. The philosophical justification for what some would call murder and they called sacred violence was central to their training. Nizari thinkers framed targeted killing as a tragic but necessary tool in a world where oppressive rulers and hostile clerics used their positions to persecute the faithful. Rather than celebrate bloodshed, internal texts emphasized intention, restraint, and proportionality. A legitimate target was not every enemy, but specific figures whose removal could protect the community or shift unjust power structures. Killing for personal revenge, greed, or undisciplined hatred was condemned. Acting under authorized command in defense of the community was framed as a grim duty. In this way, the Fidai learned to see himself not as a killer for hire, but as an instrument of controlled, purposeful violence in a brutal age. Recruitment focused on individuals with particular talents rather than generic zeal. Some were chosen for their ability to memorize details and remain calm under scrutiny. Others had physical attributes, climbing skill, agility in tight spaces, endurance for long journeys. A few brought social advantages, literacy that enabled them to blend into administrative roles, trading experience that made cross-border movement natural, or existing access to courts and garrisons. What united them was not a single personality type, but a combination of internal discipline and external adaptability. The order didn't need fanatics who burned out quickly. It needed people who could act ordinary for years, then extraordinary for seconds. Stories of early fidais circulated inside Nizari circles as both warning and inspiration. One tale spoke of an operative who spent years serving quietly in the retinue of a hostile governor, enduring insults and beatings without revealing his true purpose, until the day he calmly stepped forward in a public ceremony and struck down his target with a dagger, fully aware he would be killed on the spot. Another told of a fidai who accepted a post as a minor clerk in a fortress, slowly gaining the trust of the commander, and then opening the gates to Nizari forces on a pre-arranged night. These stories didn't just glorify bravery. They reinforced the virtues of patience, obedience to timing, and the belief that a single life spent well could have strategic consequences far beyond its apparent weight. The cumulative effect of these lives, lived in shadows and ending in sudden flashes of violence, created a reputation that no proclamation or sermon could match. Rulers began to change travel habits, surround themselves with guards even in supposedly safe spaces, and hesitate before publicly denouncing Nizari communities. Knights and emirs, who once scoffed at mountain heretics, started to wonder which servant, guard, or merchant around them might belong to a network whose loyalty was stronger than fear of death. But every system built on such intense discipline carries a hidden question. What happens if the belief that sustains it begins to crack, or if the outside world changes faster than its internal doctrine can adapt? For the fidais of Alamut and beyond, that question would become painfully real when a new enemy arrived, one that could not be deterred by surgical fear, and for whom individual lives, however devoted, meant almost nothing at all. A single dagger could shake an entire kingdom. For the Nizari assassins, violence was never the goal in itself. It was a language. Killing indiscriminately would have turned every ruler into an implacable enemy and every population into an informant network against them. Instead, they avoided unnecessary bloodshed because they understood that scarcity made each act more powerful. When only a few carefully chosen targets die, people ask why those men and not others. That why was the real battlefield the assassins wanted to fight on. In the minds of rulers, jurists, commanders, and clerics who suddenly realized that certain behaviors came with invisible but very real consequences. Eliminations were planned as political messages, not as simple murders. A brutal local governor who persecuted Nizari communities might be killed in front of his own troops, demonstrating that rank and armor could not shield him from accountability. A powerful scholar who issued hostile fatwas might be struck down in a mosque, turning his own pulpit into a stage on which the order delivered its counter-argument in steel. The timing, location, and method of each assassination were chosen to communicate something specific. Your power is not absolute. We are closer than you think, or we can reach you even here. The assassination itself ended a life. The way it was done rewrote calculations in countless other minds. This strategy demanded mastery of close range, public execution. Fidais were trained to approach targets in crowded spaces, markets, mosques, processions, where weapons were unexpected and escape routes limited. They learned how to strike from arm's length, aiming for vital points that guaranteed death, even if they were killed moments later. The point was not to survive the attack, but to ensure that all witnesses understood what had happened and who had done it. Long-range ambushes or poison could be deniable. A fidai shouting a Nizari formula as he plunged a dagger into a vizier's chest in front of hundreds of people could not. In an age when armies routinely ravaged towns and slaughtered civilians, the assassins' tactic of sparing non-combatants stood out as an anomaly. Their violence was surgical, directed primarily at political, military, or religious leaders, not at ordinary people. This wasn't humanitarianism in the modern sense, but strategic calculation. Killing civilians generates chaos and blind hatred. Killing specific figures generates fear concentrated where it matters most. By minimizing collateral damage, they reduced popular rage against them, while maximizing elite anxiety. Ordinary villagers might only know the assassins as those mountain people who sometimes kill tyrants. Princes knew them as the ones who might be coming for them personally. The psychological effect of this approach replaced the need for massed armies in many situations. Where another power might march 10,000 soldiers to force a treaty, the assassins needed only the credible threat that a single dagger could appear at the wrong moment. Rulers began to alter behavior preemptively, softening persecution of Nizari communities, moderating public denunciations, or agreeing to neutral coexistence because the cost of defiance felt immediate and personal. Fear reshaped diplomacy. Instead of asking, "Can I defeat their army?" leaders asked, "Can I protect myself every hour of every day from a man willing to die just to reach me?" Selective targeting also created an unexpected political balance. By choosing when and whom to strike, the Nizaris nudged regional power structures without ever fielding large forces. In some cases, removing particularly aggressive commanders slowed campaigns against Nizari territories. In others, eliminating a single influential courtier tilted succession struggles or policy debates. The assassins became, in effect, a shadow veto power in the politics of Persia and Syria. They could not dictate outcomes, but they could prevent certain outcomes from becoming safe options for their enemies. That invisible constraint shaped strategies across multiple courts. Because of this, rulers often negotiated instead of simply retaliating. A full-scale campaign against Nizari fortresses was expensive, dangerous, and never guaranteed complete success. Even if a stronghold fell, surviving fidais could continue operating in secrecy. Many sultans and emirs concluded that coexistence or limited agreement was preferable to a war they might win on paper but lose in personal security. In some cases, leaders quietly agreed not to harass Nizari populations or to avoid endorsing anti-Ismaili campaigns in exchange for being left off the order's list of targets. The assassins, who lacked the manpower to conquer states, instead created a system where states chose restraint to avoid drawing their focused hostility. This approach effectively rewrote medieval strategy without building anything resembling a conventional army. Classical strategy revolved around territory, fortresses, and massed troops. The Nizaris introduced a different logic. That influence could be exerted through selective, symbolic acts of violence rather than occupation. They demonstrated that fear, if precisely directed, could compensate for numerical weakness and geographic isolation. Their enemies still fought traditional wars, but those wars were now fought under an invisible shadow. Every commander and minister, aware that decisions made today might bring a blade to his throat months or years later. Yet this weapon of fear had limits that were not always visible from Alamut's high walls. It relied on rulers being rational enough to respond to targeted killings with caution rather than blind fury. It assumed enemies cared about personal survival as much as they cared about vengeance or ideology. And while fear could shape behavior, it could not stop forces driven by different calculations, forces for whom losses were acceptable, casualties meaningless, and terror itself a tool to be escalated rather than avoided. The assassins had mastered the art of controlling princes and governors who wanted to stay alive. Soon they would face opponents who measured success not in surviving danger, but in how completely they could burn away anything that stood in their path. Enemies feared them, rivals respected them, some even hired them. The first encounters between the assassins and the Crusaders unfolded in Syria, where Nizari communities had established fortresses in mountainous regions near Frankish territories. When the Crusaders captured Apamea in 1106, they came face to face with the Nizari presence, seizing an Ismaili missionary named Abu Tahir, who eventually secured his freedom through ransom. This early interaction set a pattern. Neither side saw the other as natural allies, but neither could afford total war. The Nizaris, surrounded by hostile Sunni powers and Crusader states, needed flexibility. The Crusaders, struggling to maintain footholds in hostile territory, recognized that making enemies of every local power was strategically foolish. Over time, diplomacy produced unexpected partnerships that shocked observers on both sides. The Nizaris formed tactical alliances with Crusader forces against mutual enemies, particularly when facing threats from powerful Muslim rulers. In 1230, Nizari fighters joined hospitaller campaigns against Bohemond IV of Antioch, demonstrating that strategic necessity could override religious boundaries. These pragmatic arrangements horrified Muslim chroniclers and confused European observers, both of whom expected religious wars to follow clear doctrinal lines. But on the ground, survival demanded deals that theory would condemn. Crusader attempts to capture Nizari strongholds, including efforts to reach even distant Alamut, generally failed or were never seriously pursued. The mountainous terrain that protected Nizari fortresses in Syria, castles like Masyaf, Kaf, and Kadmus, made them as difficult for Frankish knights to assault as they were for Sunni armies. Moreover, attacking the assassins carried risks beyond military defeat. Targeting them meant inviting targeted retaliation against Crusader leaders who could not be protected every moment of every day. After Raymond II of Tripoli became the first Frankish victim of Nizari assassination around 1152, Crusader forces responded with fury, massacring Muslims and invading Nizari territories. But sustained campaigns proved costly and inconclusive, leading eventually to an uneasy accommodation. Saladin's war against the Nizari order became one of the most dramatic episodes in their history, punctuated by multiple assassination attempts that nearly succeeded. The great Sultan, unifier of Muslim forces against the Crusaders, viewed the Nizaris as dangerous heretics whose elimination would strengthen his legitimacy and remove a destabilizing force. But the Nizaris, led in Syria by the formidable Rashid al-Din Sinan, the figure Europeans would mythologize as the Old Man of the Mountain, struck back with their signature weapon. In 1175, a Fida'i rushed Saladin's tent and struck at his head with a knife. Only his helmet saved him. A second attempt followed in 1176, when Saladin awoke to find hot scones, an assassin's signature, beside his bed with a poisoned dagger, pinning a note threatening his life if he continued his assault. Shaken, Saladin eventually negotiated a truce with Sinan, recognizing that pursuing the Nizaris further risked his life without guaranteeing their destruction. The Franks both feared and admired the Nizaris for reasons that blended incomprehension and respect. Crusader knights trained in open battle and siege warfare found the Nizari approach, patient infiltration, sudden public strikes, and willingness to die in the act, both unsettling and fascinating. Some saw them as fanatics. Others recognized a form of discipline and strategic thinking that rivaled their own military orders. The fact that Nizaris could be negotiated with, that they honored agreements when it served their interests, and that they targeted specific individuals rather than slaughtering indiscriminately, set them apart from the chaotic violence of medieval warfare. They were enemies, but comprehensible ones, unlike the often demonized image of Saracens in Crusader propaganda. Arab chroniclers, particularly those writing from Sunni courts hostile to Ismaili theology, recorded encounters through lenses of sectarian rivalry and political anxiety. They emphasized Nizari heterodoxy, framing assassinations as acts of heretical fanaticism rather than calculated political strategy. These accounts, while valuable historical sources, carried biases that shaped how the Nizaris were remembered, as dangerous outsiders rather than participants in the complex power struggles of the medieval Near East. Yet even hostile chroniclers could not ignore Nizari effectiveness. Their ability to influence events far beyond their numerical strength demanded explanation, even if that explanation leaned toward demonization. Western knights and chroniclers fundamentally misunderstood Nizari doctrine, a confusion that would spawn centuries of legend. Lacking knowledge of Ismaili theology and relying on garbled second-hand accounts, crusaders interpreted Nizari actions through their own frameworks. They assumed brainwashing, drugs, or elaborate deceptions must explain why men would willingly die in assassination attempts. The idea that religious conviction and political strategy could merge into something coherent and rational seemed implausible to observers who saw religion and ruthless politics as separate categories. This incomprehension laid the groundwork for the Hashish myth and other fantasies that would later dominate European imagination. Yet despite misunderstandings and mutual hostility, the tiny mountain sect shaped the strategies of global powers in ways no one could have predicted from Alamut's founding. Saladin, the greatest Muslim military leader of the age, was forced to divert resources and eventually negotiate rather than crush them. Crusader states learned to treat Nizari territories with cautious respect, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as partners against common threats. The Nizaris became, in effect, a wild card in the politics of the Levant, too dangerous to ignore, too useful to annihilate, too independent to control. Their success revealed a truth that great empires struggled to accept, that size and conventional military strength were not the only forms of power that mattered. A small group, disciplined and ideologically cohesive, operating from defensible positions and willing to employ targeted violence with strategic intelligence, could exert influence out of all proportion to its numbers. But every strategy contains the seeds of its own obsolescence. The tactics that worked against sultans seeking legitimacy and crusader lords who valued their lives would mean nothing against an enemy for whom destruction was the point, not a means to an end. And that enemy was already moving. To outsiders, they were ghosts. To each other, a family. Daily life inside Nizari fortresses followed rhythms invisible to the outside world, but carefully structured within. Residents woke before dawn for prayers, then moved into routines that blended spiritual practice, physical training, communal labor, and intellectual study. The fortresses were not merely military installations, but complete communities where children played, artisans worked, and scholars debated theology late into the night. Morning hours might see warriors drilling in courtyard spaces, while scribes copied manuscripts in adjacent rooms, and farmers tended terraced gardens clinging to steep mountainsides. Each person had defined roles, but everyone shared the isolation and the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Education within these walls reached levels that would surprise those who imagined the assassins as mindless fanatics. Young students studied Quranic interpretation through Ismaili lenses, learning the esoteric readings that set Nizari theology apart from mainstream Sunni and Shia traditions. They mastered multiple languages, Arabic, Persian, and local dialects, enabling them to move through diverse regions without arousing suspicion. Stealth techniques were taught alongside philosophy: how to walk silently, how to climb rock faces, how to read a room's power dynamics, and how to vanish into crowds. The curriculum aimed to produce individuals who were intellectually sophisticated, spiritually grounded, and tactically competent, warrior scholars rather than simple soldiers. Gender roles within the order remain partially obscured by sources written almost entirely by outsiders and enemies. Yet hints suggest women held more complex positions than conventional medieval narratives acknowledge. Women managed households, educated children in Nizari doctrine, and participated in the intellectual life of fortress communities. Some accounts suggest female operatives existed, using their ability to move through domestic spaces and social networks that male fidais could not easily access. While the public face of Nizari violence was overwhelmingly male, the infrastructure sustaining that violence, intelligence gathering, safe houses, coded messages passed through market conversations, likely involved women whose contributions were deliberately hidden to protect them and maintain operational security. Cryptography and coded communication formed essential skills for maintaining the network's coherence across vast distances. Letters between fortresses and agents in distant cities used ciphers, symbolic references, and layered meanings that appeared innocuous to interceptors but conveyed precise instructions to trained readers. A merchant's complaint about delayed shipments might encode information about troop movements. A theological discussion could contain operational orders disguised as scriptural interpretation. Messengers memorized routes, safe houses, and recognition signals that allowed them to traverse hostile territories while carrying information too sensitive to commit fully to paper. This communication web turned scattered fortresses into nodes of a functioning intelligence network. The libraries housed within Nizari strongholds represented one of their most significant but least visible achievements. Alamut's library was legendary, containing not just Ismaili religious texts, but works of philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and history collected from across the Islamic world. Scholars preserved manuscripts that Sunni authorities might have destroyed, copied rare texts, and produced original commentaries that advanced theological and philosophical debates. When Mongol forces eventually destroyed Alamut, the loss of these libraries was an intellectual catastrophe whose full extent will never be known. These collections transformed mountain fortresses into centers of learning that attracted scholars and protected knowledge during turbulent times. Food, work, and ritual created the texture of daily existence in these isolated communities. Meals were communal affairs where news was shared, disputes mediated, and bonds reinforced through shared bread. Agricultural work on terraced plots provided sustenance and occupied those not assigned to military or scholarly duties. Seasonal festivals marked the passage of time, blending Ismaili religious observances with local customs adapted to mountain life. The rhythm of isolation, months without contact from the outside world, punctuated by messengers bringing news of distant events, created a psychological environment where the community itself became both refuge and universe. Beyond the Fidais and scholars lived the broader community that made fortress life possible. Farmers who coaxed crops from rocky soil, blacksmiths who forged tools and weapons, masons who maintained walls against weather and time, weavers who produced cloth, cooks who turned limited provisions into meals, and families who raised children, knowing those children might one day be called to missions from which they would not return. These ordinary people, whose names history rarely preserved, were as essential to Nizari survival as any famous leader or daring operative. They formed the stable foundation upon which the dramatic surface events rested. Unity in times of crisis came not from forced conformity, but from shared conviction and mutual dependence. When external enemies threatened, when internal disputes arose, or when leaders died and succession loomed uncertain, the community drew strength from its ideological cohesion and the practical reality that survival required cooperation. The same isolation that protected them from enemies also meant that internal conflict could be catastrophic. Mechanisms for resolving disputes, councils of elders, appeals to religious authority, reminders of shared sacrifice, helped maintain stability without the rigid hierarchies typical of medieval military orders. Flexibility within a framework of shared purpose allowed the order to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving its core identity. Yet this insular world, for all its strengths, contained a vulnerability its inhabitants could not fully perceive. Communities that turn inward for protection develop blind spots about threats they have never encountered. The Nizaris had learned to navigate a world of sultans and crusaders, of political intrigue and religious rivalry, of enemies who could be deterred or negotiated with. Their entire system was optimized for that environment. What they had not prepared for was an enemy that did not fear death, did not care about intimidation, and viewed negotiation as weakness. An enemy that believed the world could be remade only after everything old had been ground to dust. That enemy was now crossing mountains and deserts, moving toward Persia with the inevitability of a storm that cannot be reasoned with, only endured or destroyed by. History remembers, but not always truthfully, the hashish myth, the idea that the assassins derived their name from drug use and controlled their operatives through intoxication, served political purposes far more than historical accuracy. The term assassin likely derives from Hashashin, which could reference various things: followers of Hassan-i Sabbah, users of hashish, or simply a derogatory term hurled by enemies. Sunni polemicists weaponized the hashish association to discredit Nizari claims to religious legitimacy, suggesting that only drugs could explain why rational people would follow such heretical doctrines. By framing Nizari devotion as chemically induced delusion rather than genuine conviction, hostile chroniclers dismissed them as mindless fanatics rather than ideological opponents with coherent beliefs worth taking seriously. Crusader exaggerations and mistranslations amplified these distortions exponentially. European knights encountering the Nizaris lacked linguistic tools and cultural context to understand Ismaili theology or the strategic logic behind targeted assassinations. Faced with operatives willing to die completing missions, crusaders reached for explanations that made sense within their own frameworks. Surely these men must be drugged, deceived, or enslaved through some elaborate trick. The Arabic word Hashashin, itself possibly a slur, was heard, mispronounced and reinterpreted through Latin and vernacular European languages, eventually giving us assassin as a common noun divorced from its historical origins. What began as enemy propaganda became linguistic fact embedded in European vocabularies. Sunni Muslim chroniclers engaged in deliberate demonization for theological and political reasons. The Nizaris represented a serious challenge to Sunni orthodoxy and the legitimacy of Sunni rulers who claimed exclusive authority over the Muslim community. By portraying them as heretics who had abandoned true Islam for cult-like devotion to a false prophet, Sunni writers sought to isolate them religiously while justifying political and military campaigns against them. These accounts emphasized alleged Nizari deviations, secret rituals, and immoral practices, standard accusations hurled at religious minorities throughout history, while minimizing or ignoring the intellectual sophistication and strategic rationality that characterized the order's actual operations. Marco Polo's account, written centuries after his supposed travels and based largely on hearsay, became one of the most influential sources spreading fantasy disguised as fact. Polo's narrative featured an old man of the mountain who drugged young men, transported them to a fabricated paradise complete with beautiful women and luxury, then told them they could return to this paradise after death if they obeyed his commands. This tale, vivid, exotic, and completely unverifiable, captivated European imaginations precisely because it confirmed existing prejudices about Eastern despotism and gullible fanatics. Polo's account became canonical in European thought, despite having no basis in actual Nizari doctrine or practice, demonstrating how a good story can overwhelm inconvenient facts. The invented legend of the Paradise Gardens became perhaps the most persistent myth. According to these tales, Hassan-i Sabbah constructed elaborate gardens filled with fountains, fruits, wine, and willing companions, then used drugs to make initiates believe they had experienced a foretaste of paradise promised to martyrs. In reality, this legend appears nowhere in contemporary Nizari sources or reliable accounts from the period. It emerged from hostile propaganda, was embellished by travelers repeating second-hand stories, and eventually solidified into common knowledge repeated across centuries. The myth served a function. It allowed observers to avoid confronting the reality that people might willingly sacrifice themselves for deeply held religious and political convictions without being tricked or drugged. Western obsession with mind-controlled killers reveals more about European anxieties than Nizari reality. The image of warriors whose wills had been stolen through chemical or psychological manipulation appealed to societies trying to understand religious violence that didn't fit their categories. If Nizari fidais were drugged automatons rather than rational actors making informed choices, they could be dismissed as victims of manipulation rather than engaged as opponents with genuine grievances and strategic intelligence. This narrative also allowed Western powers to avoid uncomfortable questions about their own use of violence, assassination, and coercion by positioning such tactics as uniquely Eastern and inherently connected to despotism and deception. Modern pop culture has amplified and distorted these myths beyond anything medieval propagandists imagined. Video games, films, novels, and conspiracy theories present assassins as superhuman killers with mystical powers, ancient conspiracies, and abilities that border on the supernatural. The actual historical Nizari Ismailis, a religious minority using targeted political violence within specific medieval contexts, have been transformed into universal archetypes of secret societies, ninja-like warriors, and shadowy manipulators controlling world events from behind the scenes. These modern fantasies entertain and sell products, but they bury the real history under layers of invented mythology that most audiences never penetrate. What contemporary documents actually say is both more mundane and more interesting than the myths. Nizari texts emphasize theological arguments, legitimate succession from the Prophet Muhammad through Ali and his descendants, and the duty to resist oppression. Enemy accounts, when stripped of polemical exaggeration, describe a militarily inferior group using targeted killings strategically to influence politics without the resources for conventional warfare. There are no contemporary Nizari sources describing drug use, paradise gardens, or mind control. These appear exclusively in hostile accounts written by people with clear motives to discredit and demonize. The silence in Nizari sources is as telling as the noise in enemy propaganda. What documents don't say is equally significant. They don't explain in detail how fidais were trained psychologically, what internal debates occurred about the morality of assassination, how families coped with members who left on missions and never returned, or what ordinary believers thought about the violent tactics employed in their name. The human complexity, the internal contradictions, and the daily realities of life in the order remain largely inaccessible, filtered through hostile witnesses, or lost to the destruction of Nizari archives. The gap between myth and reality matters because it shapes how violence, resistance, and religious conviction are understood. The fantasies obscure the fact that the Nizaris were rational actors navigating an impossible political situation with limited tools. Not drugged zombies or evil masterminds, but people trying to survive and preserve their community under extreme pressure. And soon, all the myths and all the reality would collide with a force that cared for neither, an empire that would write its own version of history in the ashes of everything that came before. No legend survives a force that wants the world to burn. The first Mongol encounters with Nizari emissaries revealed a fundamental miscalculation. The Nizaris assumed they were dealing with yet another power that could be negotiated with, threatened, or strategically accommodated. When Mongol forces began moving into Persia in the 1250s under Hulagu Khan, Nizari leaders attempted their usual approach, diplomatic overtures mixed with implied threats. But the Mongols operated under different logic. They did not seek tribute, territory, or political advantage in the conventional sense. They sought absolute submission or total annihilation. The tactic of targeted assassination that had worked against sultans protecting their lives meant nothing to commanders who saw individual death as irrelevant compared to the horde's unstoppable momentum. Hulagu Khan's campaign against the Nizari state was not merely military conquest, but systematic eradication. Mongol intelligence, far superior to what most medieval powers possessed, had mapped Nizari strongholds, supply routes, and leadership structures with precision. Hulagu demanded unconditional surrender from the Nizari Imam Rukn al-Din Khursha, offering terms that left no room for negotiation: submit completely, dismantle all fortifications, and accept Mongol authority without reservation. When Khursha hesitated and attempted to buy time through partial compliance, the Mongols interpreted this as defiance and proceeded to demonstrate what defiance cost. The siege technology Mongols brought to Persia neutralized the mountain fortresses that had protected the Nizaris for over a century and a half. Chinese engineers traveling with Mongol armies brought trebuchets, siege engines, and explosive devices capable of breaking fortifications that had seemed impregnable to previous attackers. More critically, Mongol logistical capabilities meant they could sustain sieges indefinitely, surrounding strongholds and starving them out while maintaining supply lines across vast distances. The high, defensible positions that made Nizari castles nearly impossible for medieval Islamic or Crusader armies to assault became death traps when facing an enemy willing to methodically destroy them one by one without concern for casualties or time. The fall of Alamut in 1256 marked not just military defeat, but cultural catastrophe. After a brief siege, Rukn al-Din surrendered the fortress under promises of safe passage that Hulagu had no intention of honoring. Mongol forces systematically destroyed the castle's fortifications and, most devastatingly, burned its legendary library. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, rare manuscripts, scientific treatises, philosophical works, and Nizari theological texts went up in flames. The intellectual heart of Nizari culture was ripped out and incinerated, an act of cultural destruction whose full cost can never be measured because we will never know precisely what was lost. A few texts survived because they had been copied elsewhere, but the great collection that made Alamut a center of learning was annihilated. Scattered Nizari communities survived the initial conquest, attempting to maintain their identity and resistance in the aftermath. Not every fortress fell immediately, and not every believer was killed or captured. In remote valleys and dispersed villages, Nizaris continued to practice their faith quietly, passing traditions orally when written texts were too dangerous to possess. Some fidais remained active, carrying out isolated attacks against Mongol officials or collaborators, though without central coordination, these acts were more expressions of defiance than strategic operations. The network that had once spanned Persia and Syria fragmented into isolated pockets, trying to preserve something of what had been destroyed. Mongol propaganda shaped how the Nizaris' end was recorded and remembered. Victorious Mongol chroniclers and their Persian servants portrayed the destruction of the Nizari state as righteous elimination of heretics and troublemakers who had destabilized the region for too long. These accounts emphasized Nizari wickedness, exaggerated their crimes, and presented their destruction as inevitable and deserved. Rukn al-Din, initially promised safety, was eventually executed along with many of his family and followers, his death framed as justice rather than betrayal. By controlling the narrative, Mongol authorities attempted to ensure that the Nizaris would be remembered as a dangerous aberration rightfully crushed, rather than as a community defending its beliefs against overwhelming force. Yet fidais continued resisting long after the organized order collapsed, demonstrating that the spirit behind the movement transcended its political and military structure. Individual operatives and small cells carried out attacks for years following Alamut's fall, targeting Mongol officials, collaborators, and those who had betrayed Nizari communities. Without central direction, these acts were less coordinated, but perhaps more desperate and personal. Vengeance as much as strategy, honor as much as hope for restoration. Stories circulated of mysterious killings that bore Nizari signatures, reminders that even overwhelming force could not guarantee absolute security, though these were more epilogues than new chapters in Nizari history. The order's spirit survived its physical destruction because it had never been entirely about fortresses, libraries, or even the fidais themselves. At its core lay a theological and political identity. The Nizari Ismaili community's belief in their lineage of imams, their understanding of justice, and their right to exist despite persecution. These ideas could not be destroyed by burning buildings or killing leaders because they lived in the minds and practices of scattered believers who preserved them through secrecy, oral tradition, and quiet persistence. The Nizari community did not disappear after the Mongols. It went underground, surviving in forms that often escaped historical notice because survival required invisibility. In subsequent centuries, Nizari Ismailis would gradually re-emerge, eventually establishing the lineage that continues today under the leadership of the Aga Khan. Their modern community bears little resemblance to the medieval fortress-dwelling assassins of legend, but the continuity of theological tradition and communal identity connects them directly to Hassan-i Sabbah's original movement. The Mongol storm destroyed a political state and military organization, but it could not erase the faith and identity that had motivated them. Yet the question remained, echoing through the centuries. What lessons could be drawn from a movement that had rewritten the rules of medieval power only to be swept away by an enemy that played by no rules at all? And what would future generations, armed with fragments, myths, and distorted histories, make of the shadows those mountain warriors had once cast across empires? The answer would depend less on what actually happened than on what people needed the story to mean. A brotherhood dies, but its ideas travel centuries. The Nizari Ismaili community's survival into modern times represents one of history's remarkable continuities, a thread running from Hassan-i Sabbah's mountain fortresses to contemporary global communities. After the Mongol destruction, scattered Nizaris preserved their faith through taqiyya, religiously sanctioned concealment of beliefs in the face of persecution, passing traditions through family lines and trusted teachers rather than public institutions. Over centuries, the community reconstituted itself across Persia, Central Asia, South Asia, and eventually worldwide, maintaining theological distinctiveness while adapting to vastly changed political circumstances. Today's Nizari Ismailis, led by the Aga Khan, number in the millions and bear little surface resemblance to medieval fidais, yet they trace unbroken lineage to the same imamate and theological principles that motivated the Order of Assassins. The influence on espionage, intelligence gathering, and covert operations echoes through centuries of statecraft, though often unacknowledged. The Nizari model, small, ideologically committed units operating with strategic patience, deep cover infiltration, and targeted elimination of key figures, anticipated concepts that modern intelligence agencies would later systematize. While there's no direct organizational lineage between medieval assassins and modern spy services, the strategic logic they pioneered reappears wherever asymmetric power dynamics demand unconventional approaches, that careful intelligence can replace massive force, that targeting specific individuals can achieve what armies cannot, and that fear strategically deployed becomes a force multiplier. How assassin became a common word illustrates the power of propaganda to outlive historical reality. The Arabic Hashashin, whether it meant followers of Hassan, hashish users, or was simply an insult, passed through Crusader encounters into European languages as assassin, gradually losing its specific religious and political context to become a generic term for political murder. This linguistic evolution buried the actual Nizari Ismailis beneath a word that now means something almost opposite to their careful, strategic approach. Today, assassination suggests any political killing, whether surgical or chaotic, planned or opportunistic. The real organization that pioneered targeted political violence as strategy became linguistically synonymous with all political killing, their specificity lost in translation. Their unexpected impact on political theory emerges in discussions of asymmetric warfare, resistance movements, and the limits of state power. The Nizaris demonstrated that a small group lacking conventional military strength could still influence political outcomes through strategic use of fear, intelligence, and selective violence. This challenged assumptions about power, requiring armies, territory, and economic resources, opening conceptual space for thinking about how weak actors could resist strong states through unconventional means. Modern theorists analyzing insurgency, terrorism, and guerrilla warfare often unknowingly reference dynamics the assassins pioneered, even when they don't cite them directly. The lessons in power, fear, and asymmetric warfare remain relevant precisely because power imbalances persist. The Nizaris showed that fear could be more effective when precisely targeted rather than randomly spread, that restraint could enhance rather than diminish psychological impact, and that reputation could substitute for actual force in many situations. These insights matter whenever weaker parties face stronger opponents, not as justifications for violence, but as analytical observations about how influence operates outside conventional military frameworks. The ethical questions their methods raised: when is targeted killing justified? Who decides legitimate targets? Where is the line between resistance and terror? Remain unresolved in contemporary debates about drones, special operations, and political violence. Modern fascination with the assassins blends historical interest with projection of contemporary anxieties about secret societies, hidden power, and disciplined violence. They appear in countless novels, games, and films precisely because they occupy a narrative sweet spot, exotic enough to seem mysterious, historical enough to feel grounded, and violent enough to generate drama. The combination of religious devotion, martial skill, and shadowy operations creates an archetype that audiences find compelling across cultures and eras. Yet this fascination often says more about modern concerns, fears about terrorism, fantasies about secret knowledge, anxieties about control, than about the actual medieval Nizaris. Separating the real organization from Hollywood and pop culture versions requires patient excavation of sources beneath layers of legend. The real Nizaris were a religious minority using political violence strategically within specific historical contexts, not superhuman warriors with mystical powers or evil masterminds controlling world events. They weren't drug zombies, but ideologically committed believers. They weren't indiscriminate killers, but strategic operators who avoided unnecessary casualties. They weren't mysterious for the sake of mystique, but secretive for survival. The actual history, more complex, more human, and more interesting than fantasy, gets buried under entertaining myths that serve contemporary narratives rather than historical understanding. The Hashashin remain an eternal symbol of shadow power because they embody enduring tensions in how societies think about violence, resistance, and hidden influence. They represent the fantasy that small groups with sufficient discipline and conviction can challenge empires, a narrative that appeals to both revolutionaries imagining resistance and establishments warning against subversion. They symbolize the fear that invisible enemies might be anywhere, that power can be struck at its heart regardless of walls and guards, that no position is truly safe from determined opponents. These symbolic functions ensure their legend persists independently of historical accuracy, constantly remade to serve new purposes. What made the assassins' legacy endure was not the castles they built or the enemies they killed, but the questions they forced into historical consciousness. Can a small group with limited resources shape the course of empires? When does targeted violence become strategy rather than mere murder? Where is the line between legitimate resistance and unjustifiable terror? How much does fear matter in the calculus of power? These questions outlived Alamut's stones and the Fidai's blades because they touch something fundamental about how humans organize violence, authority, and resistance. The medieval Nizari Ismailis asked them with daggers in crowded markets, Modern societies ask them with drones, cyber attacks, and special operations forces. The tools change, but the underlying dilemmas remain. And perhaps that's why, centuries after the last Fidai walked into a crowded square with a concealed blade and unshakable purpose, the shadow of Alamut still falls across our debates about power, fear, and how far conviction should be allowed to carry violence in its wake. The truth about the Nizari assassins, stripped of hashish myths, paradise gardens, and mind control fantasies, reveals something far more fascinating than any legend. A real community of people who faced impossible odds and responded with strategic brilliance, ideological conviction, and disciplined violence that changed how power itself was understood. They were not drugged fanatics, but rational actors navigating a brutal medieval world with limited resources and profound faith. People who chose to make their small numbers count through precision rather than scale, fear rather than conquest, and ideas rather than territory. The human reality, complete with internal debates, moral compromises, family sacrifices, and the daily grind of survival in mountain fortresses, is infinitely richer than the shallow stereotypes popular culture has sold for centuries. The assassins fundamentally shaped how later civilizations thought about loyalty, discipline, and covert operations in ways that echo through modern intelligence agencies, special forces doctrines, and resistance movements worldwide. They demonstrated that a small group bound by shared conviction could exert influence vastly disproportionate to its size, that targeted violence could achieve what massed armies could not, and that reputation carefully cultivated became a weapon as powerful as any blade. Their model of patient infiltration, strategic elimination, and psychological warfare anticipated methods that nation-states would later systematize and that asymmetric conflicts would repeatedly validate. Whether acknowledged or not, the shadow of their approach extends over every discussion of how weak actors resist strong states, how fear functions as political currency, and where the line falls between legitimate resistance and unjustifiable terror. What their story ultimately reveals is an uncomfortable truth about power, that shadows often move history more decisively than the armies marching in sunlight. While sultans commanded thousands and crusaders besieged cities, a few hundred fidais operating from mountain fortresses influenced the decisions of empires through carefully planned actions that struck at the psychological heart of authority rather than its military muscle. The Nizaris proved that visibility and conventional strength are not prerequisites for historical impact, that discipline and conviction can substitute for numbers, and that the willingness to operate outside conventional rules can reshape those rules themselves. Their empire was never marked on maps, but it existed nonetheless, in the calculations of rulers who changed policies to avoid becoming targets, in the strategic restraint of enemies who chose negotiation over confrontation, and in the slow transformation of how medieval powers understood vulnerability and influence. The assassins' greatest legacy may be the questions they leave unresolved. When does strategic violence become justified resistance? And when does it cross into terrorism? Can small groups committed to unconventional tactics legitimately challenge established powers? Where is the boundary between fearsome reputation and actual capability? These questions remain urgently relevant in an era of asymmetric conflicts, covert operations, and debates about legitimate force, proving that the empire of Shadows, Hassan-i Sabbah, built in the mountains of Persia, never truly ended. It simply changed form, waiting in the ambiguities of every political crisis, where weak actors face strong states and conventional rules seem insufficient. If you want more stories that dig beneath the myths to uncover the complex human truths of history's most misunderstood groups, subscribe to support this deep research into the shadows where real history lives. Leave a like if you're ready to see past Hollywood fantasies to historical reality, and comment what city you're watching from. because the truth connects us across centuries and continents, revealing that the past is never as simple as the legends claim.